starting at verse 26. Acts chapter 8, starting at verse 26, and I'm going to go to verse 40. Now, an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." So he started out, and on his way met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of Candace, queen of Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, "Go to that chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. "Do you understand what you're reading?" Philip asked. "How can I," he said, "unless someone explains it to me?" So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. The eunuch was reading this passage of scripture. "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before the shearer is silent. So he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. Why shouldn't I be baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about, preaching the gospel in all the towns until he reached Caesarea. So, I'm always struck by the difference between stories we read in Scripture and our own current context. How many of you know an Ethiopian? One. Great. How many of you know a eunuch? A eunuch. Exactly. So if you don't know what those things are, these seem like trivial details. They seem like things that are just sort of describing the guy and we're going to move on our way. But to the immediate audience, to people who this story was told to within a few years, to people who this story was written down for and passed along for the first few centuries, they knew how weird this entire interaction was. So let's unpack that a little bit. This gentleman who is unnamed, the Ethiopian eunuch, was responsible for all of the money for a queen. Now there's a few things involved in that. Number one, you had to be trusted 100% to both be a man, to have such close interactions with the Queen of Ethiopia, and to be in charge of all of her money, and not be a relative. So the way that they would do that is at a very young age, they would remove this person's genitals. That's what a eunuch is. It's a man who does not have his reproductive organs. They do it at such a young age because they don't go through puberty. They prevent a lot of the things that happen in puberty. The man would have had a very high-pitched voice. There would have been certain deformations of his physical stature and girth. Eunuchs tend to grow pear-shaped for whatever reason. They get a lot more hip weight than they do upper body strength, as a man would during puberty. So this guy would have looked very different. He would have been pear-shaped, and he would have had a high-pitched voice, which would have been weird for an Ethiopian. On top of that, they were not allowed to have any part of their body where they could hide anything, which meant that they were shaved entirely. It would be part of his job to never let hair grow anywhere on his body. So this guy was not only weirdly shaped, he was also bald, high-pitched voice, but he was so respected within his own community, within the Ethiopian palace, that he would have been decked out in finery. You would not be able to mistake this man within 1,000 yards. He would be in bright colors, he would probably have gold necklaces, jewelry, and he'd be funny-shaped and bald and have a high-pitched voice. You would not miss this guy. You knew who he was, or at least would have a very good idea that he was very different from you, if you were a citizen of Jerusalem, for example. On top of that, to make everything else different, he went to Jerusalem to worship. So not only is he physically different, not only is his voice different, but he chose to not go with the religion of his people, and he converted to Judaism. He's a convert. Man, is this guy weird. So incredibly strange. And he goes to Jerusalem, and now I don't know, the scripture doesn't tell us, how much of the Torah that he would have had access to in Ethiopia, how much of the Bible that he had been able to read. We're not sure if he knew all the customs. And I'm fairly certain that there was one he probably missed. Because he wouldn't have made the trip if he had access to Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 23. Let me go there really quick. It's one verse, verse 1. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. He couldn't go to the synagogue. He was not allowed. He was so deformed, he was not allowed to partake in any of the ceremonies of the synagogue. Now, historians tell us that there was a workaround for this, that even though he would not be allowed to go during the day with all the rest of the Jews, he would be able to see a rabbi at night. He would be able to go into the outer part of the temple, not the inner part, and he would be able to offer a sacrifice for his sins as both a convert and someone who was physically deformed. So you can imagine his frustration if he wasn't aware of these rules. If someone had not told him, if he sort of converted on a whim or converted out of limited information from a local passing rabbi, or even if the capital of Ethiopia had a synagogue, it might have, we don't know. You can imagine his frustration as making the trip